After getting standing ovations for an energy deal in Alberta yesterday, the Liberals are now trying to sell their support for an oil pipeline to the province that says it will never happen. The federal energy minister is in BC today, meeting with Premier David Eby. And earlier on Power and Politics, I asked Vancouver MP Talib Noor Mohammed how voters in that province are reacting to the deal.
I think, we are all hearing from our constituents, as we do on these very difficult, complex issues. And, look, I can tell you for certain that constituents in my riding have expressed their views very, very strongly. And our job is to make sure those views are reflected. And what my constituents consistently say is that for these types of things to happen, you have to have the consent of First Nations. Coastal First Nations are a critical component of how we make consideration in this province.
But the text of Ottawa's MOU with Alberta does not mention consent from First Nations, and the reaction from some Indigenous leadership in BC has been scathing. The president of the Union of B.C. Indian Chiefs calls it a deeply irresponsible agreement that sacrifices Indigenous peoples, coastal communities, and the environment for political convenience. I spoke to the Grand Chief earlier this afternoon. Grand Chief, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here today, sir.
Yes, good afternoon.
The MOU, this Memorandum of Understanding the Premier and the Prime Minister signed, says Alberta and Canada recognize their obligations to consult with and, where appropriate, accommodate Indigenous peoples. Never uses the word consent. What's your reaction of the direction being signaled by this language?
Well, we rely on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to be our bedrock position in regard to any and all dispositions of lands within our territories, which compels all levels of government to consult extensively with the First Nations that will be impacted. It represents the law of the land and has been a long-standing requirement for any industrial projects that are under consideration. Right. It's the gold standard.
Right. So what Tim Hodgson, the energy minister, said to me yesterday in an interview was that this agreement provides for consultation consistent with the principle of free, prior, informed consent with First Nations. So if Ottawa and Alberta and whoever an eventual pipeline proponent may be here consults with you, are there circumstances under which you would consent to a bitumen pipeline?
No, absolutely not. This is not a new issue here in British Columbia. We've had a number of epic pipeline battles here, and they've all been vehemently opposed to any further pipeline development here in BC, and the answer remains no to any pipelines.
Well, some First Nation leaders, just to clarify that, Grand Chief, they have said yes or seem willing to say yes to a pipeline for natural gas or propane. The issue seems to be bitumen. Am I understanding the distinction correctly, that certain types of pipelines, depending on what they carry, are okay with consent and with an agreement, but it is the environmental risk of bitumen that is the non-starter here?
I think it needs to be understood that First Nations, Indigenous peoples are very strongly opposed to the fossil fuel industry and all dimensions therein, including pipelines, whatever product that they're conveying. We object to the enormous risk it represents to our traditional territories, our riparian rights, the wildlife, and the direct danger to our communities.
Right, but we have seen Indigenous approval and even ownership of things like Cedar LNG and more recently the Silisms project, which does have a pipeline component to it, right? So there does seem to be an ability and a willingness to move ahead with certain types of developments, but it is the idea of a bitumen pipeline and oil tankers that seems to be the non-starter, correct?
There have been very few individual First Nations that have engaged in projects vis-a-vis the fossil fuel industry, but it doesn't represent the vast majority First Nations people, citizens within British Columbia. And we've answered this question ever since the epic Enbridge North battle, that there needs to be extensive consultation. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples compels prior and informed consent. And in regard to this particular project, we all know that it was announced without any consultation whatsoever, any effort at consultation. And again, we are vehemently opposed to the Carney-Smith backroom deal.
Okay, I want to show you, if I can, sir, a part of the interview I did with Minister Hodgins on the show yesterday, because they had reached out to Marilyn Slett, the president of the Coastal First Nations Great Bear Initiative, to meet while he's in British Columbia today. I believe they're in Vancouver. And she said it was too short notice to get there. And this is part of the conversation I had with the minister. Have a listen. Marilyn Slett did mention that you had reached out, but she says that the timeline that was offered, it's just impossible for them to get from where they are in the coast of BC to the time and place of the meeting. So,
it's called Zoom. It's called Zoom.
Well,
you know, it's a wonderful. I think that's what we're using, David.
I understand, but I'm also not a Coastal First Nation chief, and I don't know if they would want to be met with in person and face to face. You know, if they are going to have a bitumen pipeline, right?
I am happy to go visit any. I will happily make the trip.
I just wonder what your thoughts are on that, sir. The fact that they haven't met and the suggestion it didn't necessarily need to be face-to-face until the end of the interview there.
The duty to consult is the bedrock of any discussions or negotiations between First Nations and proponents of major resource development projects. Industry knows that, governments know that, we certainly know that. Any fly-by-night discussions on brief short notice does not represent the rigorous legal standards of consultation.
I wonder, in January, Grand Chief, you had said that your previous opposition to the Northern Gateway pipeline was at a different time, and you said that if we don't build that kind of infrastructure, Trump will. You clarified that later, but this is similar to the argument that the Prime Minister and supporters of this pipeline are making. So how do you view these things in this moment, that it is the rupture, the economic rupture with the United States, that is the driving force behind reigniting this pipeline issue?
Yes, we don't buy into that narrative. We have a duty in reference to our own Indigenous laws and protocols to essentially protect our lands, our waters, and the rights and interests of our people, future generations to be specific. And, you know, that's where it begins and that's where it ends. And we have expressed this time and time again with the Enbridge North battle, with the Keystone, or rather with the Kinder Morgan and TMX battle. And we shall continue to stand on our obligations to our future generations and to caretake and defend the environmental integrity of our territories. End of story.
Okay, so one last question for you, Grand Chief, before we say goodbye. Your union has said any attempt to force a pipeline through BC's coast will face unified resistance. What could resistance look like? I know you will not give consent. Should you be asked, you will not go along with it, but what would resistance look like rather than objection?
Again, this is not a new issue here in British Columbia. We've had a number of very serious conflicts with respect to the destructive impacts of the fossil fuel industry, and nothing has changed in that regard. The answer is still no. It shall remain no. And, you know, we have a duty to our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and that's a sacred duty, and it's reflected in our own laws and protocols. The answer to the Carney-Smith backroom deal is no.
Crying Chief Stewart Phillip, President of the Union of B.C. Indian Chiefs. We appreciate your time today, sir. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Okay, so in that interview, we play part of my conversation with Energy and Natural Resources Minister Tim Hodgson from yesterday's show. And in that conversation, I told the minister what the president of the Coastal First Nations had said to me about it being impossible for them to make it to the time and place where he'd offered them a meeting. And you saw there, he replied, "It's called Zoom," suggesting remote was enough. That got some pushback, and the minister has now apologized for those comments. This is a statement he posted on social media. My comments last night about a virtual meeting with Coastal First Nations were a poor choice of words, which I regret. I have reached out to them directly to apologize and look forward to an in-person meeting at their convenience. So we wanted to give you that update.